Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is Sam Smith. I'm Director of Marketing Communications for Accruit, and I'm joined by our President and CEO, Brent Abrahm. We're going to be talking today about 1031 exchanges. You may or may not know a little bit about 1031s, but our experience is that a lot of people out there don't understand fully the value that 1031 exchanges represent for their businesses, and so Brent is going to provide us with a little wisdom, a little insight into how you can be using this section of the tax code to drive more value for your business. So we're going to walk through the format we're going to use. It's going to be sort of Q&A based. In our business, we get a lot of questions, and so we've had the privilege of coming up with what we hope are fairly decent answers. So we're going to walk through some questions that we get commonly, and you may have some of these same questions yourself, and we'll let Brent answer them. The agenda is pretty straightforward. What are 1031 exchanges? Why should you care? How would you go about doing them? And finally, who is Accruit? And perhaps how can we help you? We're going to start with the most common question. Brent, what is 1031 exchange?
Well, Sam, and thank you everyone for attending. 1031 exchanges or like-kind exchanges or deferred exchanges or starker exchanges, all the same. They come from our part of the tax code, section 1031. Been around since 1921, and it's a cash flow strategy that allows companies that buy and sell assets routinely. When they sell assets for a tax gain, allows them to roll over those gains into like equipment. So it allows them to defer recognizing the gain, therefore deferring the taxes. It's almost like an interest-free loan from the government. The government has put this out there for us to use. There are significant rules we must follow, but they've recognized that the appropriate time to tax someone is not when they're exchanging an asset. It's when they're finally disposing of the asset. So if you're trying to stay competitive, you're upgrading your fleet, you're getting new equipment, the IRS says, no, that's not the appropriate time to tax you.
Now, Brent, I would note this area right here, this since 1921 part. Many people, I believe, when they first hear about 1031 exchanges, they think, oh, this is new and perhaps this is somehow controversial. It's been around since 1921, and so there's nothing controversial about it. It's pretty established, and the fact that many businesses may not know about it doesn't mean that it's not a fairly safe and reliable tax strategy for them.
No, that's a good point, Sam. We saw a very significant case in the 70s that the Supreme Court listened to about 1031s that allowed us to expand from just what we called swap or simultaneous exchanges to deferred or delayed exchanges. And in the early 90s, the Treasury came out with guidance on actually how to handle a deferred exchange. So in the early 90s, they came out with an entire part of the code section that says, here's your how-to. And then in 2000, they gave us more regulation about how to handle a reverse exchange. And in between all that, we had numerous what we call private letter rulings, where taxpayers actually go in front of the IRS and ask them if this is the appropriate way. In 2003, we saw them come out with how to handle program exchanges. So we've seen the Treasury actually embrace 1031s and allow companies to use this as a significant tax strategy, something that they feel has been well-rooted into our tax code. It's well-rooted into businesses of today, but they want to make sure people are doing it appropriately.
Exactly, and this is very good news. I think that just because a business may not know about 1031s, that's no reason to worry, because there's very well-established guidance. There's not a lot of mystery to it. There are ways of doing it. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So I think the message here is there's a lot of value. Rest easy. We can find ways of getting you through to that value in ways that are recognized by the Internal Revenue Service.
Right. And one of the things that we've seen in the past is usually people that do an exchange for $250,000 or greater on the asset that they're selling. Usually this put it into real estate. So what was very interesting is when we saw the advent of the internet and we saw technology coming on board in the late 90s, early 2000s, we found out there are multiple ways of actually still doing like-kind exchanges with lower valued assets, as long as you can make it efficient for somebody to do one. So the reason why we think a lot of people were not aware of this and mainly aware of just real estate is You don't sell a car for $250,000. You don't sell a piece of heavy equipment for $250,000. You sell multiple pieces a year.
Exactly.
And so what you needed is technology to help manage that. And that's where we've seen in the last 10 years an explosion with corporate America actually utilizing 1031s.
So people in the audience will notice that I bounced ahead a slide. Pardon me for getting ahead of us. But the next question is also a pretty common one. What kinds of assets are eligible for 1031 exchange?
Well, as we've sort of alluded to a little bit, they're really assets that are used as an investment or used in your place of business. So we have a lot of people that actually go and buy a rental home or buy a vacant piece of land for investment purposes. Year over year, they watch that appreciate. Well, you can also take advantage of assets that depreciate. And what we look at, though, we would call those tangible assets or personal property. So you have your real property, which is like-kind with every other type of like-kind property. Vacant land for a condo, condo for a building, building for a rental home. But then you take personal property, which is a little bit of a misnomer. It's everything else except real estate. So when we talk about assets depreciating in value, it's just because of the age they depreciate. But what we have found, the like-kind exchange opportunity, is the street value of the asset, or what an asset can be sold on the open market, surpasses what it is on your tax books because you've depreciated over a short period of time and the asset still has value. Even when these assets are on your tax books for $0, it has significant value on the open market. So what we look at assets like that, we look at heavy equipment, we look at fleets of vehicle, we look at oil and gas equipment. We can even look at some intangibles of licenses, radio frequency waves. Like kind is actually determined by either general asset class, so the Internal Revenue Code gave us multiple areas that we can say these assets are like kind with other assets. Or we look at the NAICS code, which is the North American Industrial Classification System. It at least tells us what assets are grouped together to be determined what is like kind.
And there's actually more flexibility there than some people might think. If you're first coming to this, you might think that the only thing that's like kind to a dozer is another dozer. But that's not necessarily true.
No, that's a great point, Sam. Like kind would be a broad category like heavy equipment, oil and gas production equipment, mining equipment, agricultural equipment. Anything that's used in that place of business under that category would be deemed like kind. You obviously always have to work with a tax advisor, your attorney, making sure you fall in the right classification, but they are very broad.
As we were talking the other day with respect to the investment recovery world, something like scrap copper is like kind with the, you can recover copper out of, you were explaining this to me.
Yeah, what you look at on the scrap side,
right.
And when we see companies saying we've got underutilized assets or surplus assets or scrap, what we don't look at is what the final use of that asset was. We don't say scrap is like kind with scrap. We say scrap is like kind with its original use. So we may have copper and transformers, and we've seen these scrapped out just for the copper, but it's a transformer was the original use, and that was the actual asset that is being scrapped. So we look at the original asset, the original intent of the asset to define what that is. We see a lot of this in the oil and gas industry. We look to a lot of tubing and casing. A lot of that's used for fence posts in the scrap market. But the oil and gas companies weren't using it as fence posts. They were using it as downhole casing and tubing. That is what's like kind.